Imagine finally lying down after a long day, only to find 5 other tired, sweaty villagers squeezing in beside you, some snoring, some shivering, and no space to stretch. Tonight, we travel back to a time when personal space didn't exist, and beds were more like packed wagons than cozy retreats. From medieval cottages to colonial farmhouses, discover why people shared beds with neighbors, siblings, even strangers, and how nighttime comfort was more of a dream than reality. So get cozy, dust, and let history remind you how lucky we are for modern blankets and a bed of our own. If weird, wild, and wonderfully boring bedtime tales help you drift off, you're in good company here. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for nightly journeys into the strange corners of history where sleep was never guaranteed, but the stories always are. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You find yourself standing in the great hall of a 14th century manor house as the last traces of daylight fade through the narrow windows. The massive stone walls that seemed so imposing during the day now offer the promise of shelter. But the reality of the evening routine is about to unfold in ways that would astonish modern sensibilities. This is not a time when privacy was valued, nor when sleeping alone was considered normal or even desirable. The hall, which served as the center of daily life, eating, and entertainment, is about to transform into a communal bedroom for anywhere between 15 and 30 people. The rushes covering the stone floor have been swept and refreshed, their sweet scent mixing with the lingering smoke from the central hearth. But as the servants begin to spread blankets and cloaks across the floor, you realize that tonight, like every night for centuries, this space will become a carefully orchestrated sleeping arrangement that governed medieval life. BBC Future tells us that beds were not just furniture in medieval times, they were symbols of wealth and status, so valuable that sharing them was both a practical necessity and a deliberate social choice. Even the nobility actively sought out bedfellows not for romantic purposes but for the unparalleled intimacy of nighttime conversations in the darkness, as well as for warmth and security. The arrangement tonight follows patterns that have developed over generations. The family of the lord of the manor, perhaps 6 people, including parents, children of various ages, and elderly relatives, will claim the largest sleeping area near the warmth of the dying fire. But they will not sleep alone. The senior servants, including the steward, the cook, and the head groom, have earned their place close to the family. The younger servants, stable boys, kitchen maids, and farm workers will form their own clusters across the hall, creating what medieval people called social sleeping. Watch as the eldest daughter takes her designated position against the wall, farthest from the main door. This is not arbitrary. It's a system of protection and hierarchy that Atlas Obscura describes as being refined over centuries of practice. Her younger sisters arrange themselves in descending order of age, each knowing exactly where they belong in this nightly ritual. The mother positions herself next, followed by the father, who serves as a barrier between the female family members and the rest of the household. The sons of the family, if they are still young enough to sleep with their parents, arrange themselves in their own age order. But tonight, there's an additional complication. A traveling merchant has arrived late in the day, seeking shelter for the night. Medieval hospitality demands that he be given a place to sleep, but medieval propriety requires careful positioning. He will sleep at the foot of the family's sleeping area as far as possible from the women and girls, a placement that protects both his reputation and theirs. As the household settles into their positions, you notice the careful etiquette that governs this intimate arrangement. These people may be sharing sleeping space, but they are not sharing beds carelessly. Each person has learned from childhood the rules of communal sleeping. Lie still, don't steal the covers, keep conversation to a whisper, and respect the invisible. boundaries that separate one person's space from another's. The merchant, grateful for shelter but unfamiliar with this particular household's arrangements, is quietly instructed by the steward about the expectations for the night. No excessive talking, no fidgeting, no reaching across others for warmth or comfort. These rules exist because when 15 people share a space the size of a modern living room, order and courtesy become matters of survival rather than mere politeness. But as you watch the household prepare for sleep, you begin to understand that this arrangement serves purposes beyond mere shelter. The young servants sleeping near the family are learning the rhythms of aristocratic life, absorbing lessons about hierarchy, respect, and proper behavior that will serve them throughout their lives. The visiting merchant is being honored with inclusion in the household's most vulnerable time, a gesture that speaks to medieval concepts of trust and reciprocity. The children, rather than being isolated in separate rooms, are surrounded by the protective presence of adults who will respond to any danger or distress during the night. The elderly relatives, who might struggle with cold or illness, benefit from the shared warmth and the immediate availability of help, if needed. Even the dogs that serve as both companions and guards are finding their places among the sleepers, adding their warmth to the collective heat that will help everyone survive the night. As the last conversations die away and the hall settles into the quiet rhythm of shared sleep, you might wonder about the practical challenges of this arrangement. How do people manage personal needs during the night? How do they maintain any sense of individuality when their sleeping hours are so completely communal? And what happens when conflicts arise between people who must share such intimate space? As the night deepens and the great hall fills with the sounds of breathing, shifting bodies, and occasional whispered conversations, you begin to understand that medieval communal sleeping was governed by an intricate web of social rules and practical accommodations that made these arrangements not just bearable, but essential to medieval society. The reality of sharing sleeping space with a dozen or more people requires a level of cooperation and mutual consideration that challenges every modern assumption about privacy and personal space. Watch the careful choreography as someone needs to step over sleeping bodies to reach the garderobe, the primitive toilet facility located at the far end of the hall. They move with practiced stealth, stepping only in designated pathways that have been unconsciously established by years of repetition. The merchant, still adjusting to the household's rhythms, discovers the sophisticated system of nonverbal communication that governs nighttime interactions. A particular kind of shifting indicates someone is too cold and needs to move closer to the fire. A specific pattern of breathing signals that someone is awake and available for quiet conversation. The positioning of arms and legs creates territories and boundaries as clearly defined as any modern property line. But the challenges go beyond mere logistics. Atlas Obscura reveals that entire families, including multiple generations, sharing single sleeping areas meant that the most intimate aspects of human life unfolded in the presence of children, elderly relatives, servants, and occasional strangers. Adult relationships, family conflicts, and personal struggles played out within hearing of everyone in the household. Tonight, as you observe the sleeping arrangements, you witness the medieval solution to this challenge of intimacy within community. The married couple at the center of the family arrangement has developed the ability to communicate through touches and whispered sounds that remain private despite the presence of so many others. Their children have learned to grant their parents a form of psychological privacy even when physical privacy is impossible. The servants, too, have their own intimate relationships and personal dramas that must be negotiated within the constraints of communal sleeping. You notice how two young kitchen maids have positioned themselves close enough to share whispered conversations about their daily struggles and romantic interests, creating a pocket of friendship and mutual support within the larger household community. But perhaps most fascinating is the way personal hygiene and health concerns are managed within this system. Medieval people were not ignorant about the transmission of disease, and they had developed practical strategies for maintaining health within these crowded sleeping arrangements. Those showing signs of illness were positioned in specific areas, where they could receive care without endangering others. Personal cleanliness, while limited by available resources, was considered a matter of courtesy to one's sleeping companions. The medieval understanding of bodily warmth as medicine meant that these sleeping arrangements served therapeutic purposes that we rarely consider today. The elderly lord's father, suffering from joint pain that would have been agonizing in a cold, isolated room, finds relief pressed between his son and daughter-in-law, their body heat providing better pain management than any medicine available at the time. Similarly, the youngest children in the household benefit from the security and warmth of being surrounded by adults, but they also serve the practical purpose of providing extra warmth to older bodies that struggle to maintain heat through the cold medieval nights. It's a symbiotic arrangement where everyone both gives and receives comfort. As the hours pass, you observe the subtle negotiations that occur when sleep patterns don't align. Some members of the household are natural early sleepers, while others remain alert well into the night. Some snore, others shift restlessly, and still others wake frequently. The medieval solution involved a kind of collective tolerance and mutual accommodation that required genuine community spirit. The traveling merchant, experiencing this arrangement for the first time, begins to understand why medieval people developed such sophisticated concepts of hospitality and guest obligation. When you invite someone to share your household sleeping space, you're offering them intimate access to your family's most vulnerable hours. In return, the guest accepts responsibility for the comfort and safety of everyone around them. But there are tensions beneath this cooperative surface. The cook's apprentice, a young man of about 16, is clearly attracted to one of the lord's daughters, but the sleeping arrangements make any inappropriate interaction both impossible and immediately visible to the entire household. The social pressure of constant observation serves as a form of behavioral control that shapes relationships and maintains order. You notice, too, how the arrangement affects individual personality development. In a world where personal privacy is virtually unknown, people develop internal lives of extraordinary richness to compensate for the lack of physical solitude. The quiet young woman lying near the wall may appear passive, but her thoughts range over complex philosophical and practical questions that she has no opportunity to explore aloud. The hall's acoustic properties mean that conversations and sounds carry further than intended, creating an environment where information flows freely throughout the household. Secrets are difficult to maintain, but this transparency also creates a kind of emotional intimacy and mutual support that modern people rarely experience. As midnight approaches and the household settles into deeper sleep, you realize that tomorrow night will bring the same arrangement with small variations. Perhaps a different traveling guest, maybe one or two household members away on errands, possibly someone suffering from illness who requires a modified sleeping position, but the essential pattern remains the same as it has for generations and will continue for centuries to come. But what happens when this carefully balanced system faces disruption? When strangers arrive who don't understand the rules, when illness threatens the safety of the group, or when personal conflicts make the enforced intimacy unbearable? How do these medieval communities handle the crises that inevitably arise? When privacy is not an option and personal space is a luxury no one can afford. By the early hours of morning, as the great hall reaches its coldest point and the last embers in the central hearth fade to ash, you witness both the vulnerability and the resilience of medieval communal sleeping arrangements. This night, like every night in this manor house, has been a careful balance of individual needs and collective survival, but it also reveals the tensions and eventual changes that would transform European sleeping practices forever. The merchant, who began the evening grateful for shelter, awakens with a deeper understanding of medieval social life than any amount of daytime interaction could have provided. He has heard the lord's wife quietly comforting a child, frightened by nightmares, witnessed the careful way the elderly father was repositioned during the night to ease his discomfort, and observed the unspoken communication between servants, who have shared sleeping space for years, but he has also experienced the challenges that eventually led to the decline of communal sleeping. The snoring of the stable master, amplified by the hall's stone walls, disrupted sleep for half the household. The restless movements of someone suffering from fleas, those persistent medieval companions that BBC Future mentions, were so common that Samuel Pepys once noted taking a bedfellow specifically to share the burden of flea bites kept others awake through much of the night. More seriously, the merchant noticed the careful way certain household members position themselves to avoid others, suggesting ongoing conflicts or incompatibilities that make the enforced intimacy difficult to bear. The kitchen maid, who placed herself as far as possible from the cook's assistant, tells a story of workplace tension that must be managed every single night. The lord's younger son, now approaching adolescence, shows signs of restlessness with an arrangement that offers no privacy for the natural changes and interests of his developing maturity. As dawn begins to lighten the hall's narrow windows, you observe the morning ritual that brings this communal sleeping period to an end. People awaken in roughly the same order they fell asleep with the early risers, typically the servants responsible for rekindling fires and beginning food preparation, moving carefully through the hall to avoid disturbing others. The process is as choreographed as the evening settling, with each person knowing their role and timing. The lord's family awakens to what amounts to a public morning routine, with personal hygiene, dressing, and early conversations unfolding, in the presence of the entire household. Privacy, as we understand it, simply does not exist. Yet you notice that people have developed psychological mechanisms for creating personal space within communal space, ways of turning inward or focusing attention that allow for individual thought and feeling even when physical privacy is impossible. But historical forces are already at work that will eventually transform these arrangements. Atlas Obscura traces the gradual shift toward private sleeping spaces that began among the wealthy in the 15th century and slowly spread through European society over the following centuries. The changes were driven by evolving concepts of hygiene, privacy, and individual rights that would eventually make communal sleeping seem not just uncomfortable, but morally questionable. The merchant represents these changing attitudes. Coming from a larger town where newer ideas about personal space and privacy are beginning to take hold, he finds the communal arrangements of this rural manor both fascinating and somewhat primitive. His presence in the hall tonight demonstrates the cultural transition period when different sleeping practices coexisted and influenced each other. Economic factors also play a role in the eventual transformation of these arrangements. As beds became less expensive and houses developed more specialized room functions, the practical necessity for communal sleeping decreased. The Great Hall gradually ceased to serve as a nighttime dormitory, becoming instead a space used only for dining and formal gatherings. Religious and moral changes further accelerated the transformation. The Protestant Reformation's emphasis on individual conscience and personal relationship with the divine created cultural pressure for private prayer and meditation spaces. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, responding to Protestant challenges, also began to emphasize the importance of family privacy and parental control over children's moral development. Medical understanding evolved as well. While medieval people were aware of disease transmission, the developing science of hygiene in the 16th and 17th centuries made communal sleeping appear increasingly dangerous. The close contact that had been valued for warmth and security began to be seen as a pathway for illness. Yet as you watch this medieval household complete its morning transformation from sleeping community to working organization, you recognize that something valuable was lost in the transition to private sleeping arrangements. The children in this household are learning social skills, emotional resilience, and community cooperation in ways that isolated sleeping could never provide. The elderly receive care and attention that they might lack in more private arrangements. The servants develop relationships of trust and mutual support that extend far beyond their working hours. The merchant, preparing to leave this household and continue his travels, carries with him not just memories of a single night's lodging, but an understanding of social relationships that was typical of medieval life. He has experienced a form of community intimacy that most modern people never encounter, the knowledge that comes from sharing the most vulnerable hours of the day with others who depend on your consideration, just as you depend on theirs. As the Great Hall returns to its daytime function and the household disperses to their various tasks, the sleeping arrangements they have just completed represent centuries of human adaptation to the practical necessities of shelter, warmth, and safety. These arrangements were not chosen from ignorance or poverty alone, but from social values that prioritized community survival over individual comfort. But the evening approaches when this medieval system will be remembered more as historical curiosity than living practice. The transformation toward private sleeping, which began among the wealthy and gradually spread through all levels of society, would fundamentally change human relationships and social organization in ways that are still unfolding today. You step through the low doorway of an Irish mud cabin in County Cork in the year 1847 at the height of the Great Famine, and immediately understand that everything you thought you knew about family living arrangements must be completely reconsidered. This single room, measuring perhaps 12 feet by 10 feet, with walls of mud, stone, and turf, rising barely 7 feet to a roughly thatched roof, contains not just the possessions of an entire family, but their entire world. RT Brainstorm reveals that at the time of the Great Famine, many Irish families were still living in these one-room cottages, where the small living space became extraordinarily crowded at night. But calling it crowded fails to capture the reality of what you're witnessing as the O'Sullivan family, parents, Seamus and Bridget, their 6 children ranging in age from 2 to 16, and their single precious cow prepare for another night in this space that serves simultaneously as kitchen, parlor, workshop, nursery, and bedroom. The earthen floor beneath your feet is uneven and damp, covered with scattered rushes and heather that provide minimal insulation against the cold seeping up from the ground. There are no windows. Glass was a luxury far beyond the reach of families like this one, and the only light comes from the central hearth, where turf burns with a smoky flame that provides essential warmth but fills the air with a haze that makes your eyes water. As evening approaches, you watch the practiced routine that transforms this single space from a daytime work area into nighttime sleeping quarters. The family's few possessions, a wooden bucket, some clay pots, tools for farming their tiny plot of land, are pushed against the walls to create as much floor space as possible. The children, who have spent the day helping with farm work or caring for younger siblings, begin to gather around the fire as their mother prepares what may be their only meal of the day. But the most striking aspect of this preparation is the inclusion of the cow in the evening routine. This animal, whose value to the family cannot be overstated, will spend the night inside the cabin with the humans. RTA Brainstorm explains that livestock, if any belonged to the family, shared these dwellings with humans, and the reasons go far beyond simple shelter. The cow represents the family's primary source of nutrition, their only significant economic asset, and their best hope for survival through the famine that has already claimed so many of their neighbors. Keeping the animal outside overnight would risk theft, predation by wild animals, or death from exposure. But beyond these practical concerns, the cow's body heat contributes significantly to warming the small space, making the difference between survival and death during the harsh Irish winter. As you observe the family's evening routine, you begin to understand the spatial choreography that makes this arrangement possible. Seamus, as the father and primary protector, will sleep closest to the door, positioned to defend against any intruder, while also serving as the first barrier between the outside cold and his family. Bridget will sleep close enough to the fire to tend it during the night, ensuring that it doesn't die out completely and leave the family vulnerable to hypothermia. The children arrange themselves according to a hierarchy based on age, vulnerability, and practical needs. The youngest, still nursing, will sleep between his parents, sharing their warmth and remaining accessible to his mother throughout the night. The older children will cluster together with the teenage daughter Mary, positioned to help care for the younger ones, while also maintaining the modest separation from her brothers that Irish Catholic custom requires even in these desperately crowded circumstances. The cow, led into the cabin as darkness falls, takes up nearly a quarter of the available floor space. But her presence is not merely tolerated, it's carefully orchestrated to maximize the benefits to the family. Her body heat warms the air that circulates throughout the small space. Her breath adds moisture that helps combat the drying effects of the turf smoke. Her bulk provides a windbreak that shields the sleeping family from drafts seeping through the poorly constructed walls. Yet as you watch this family settle into their nightly arrangement, you realize that the physical challenges are only part of the story. The complete absence of privacy means that every aspect of family life, from intimate conversations between parents to the developmental struggles of adolescent children, unfolds in the presence of everyone else. The parents' relationship, with its tensions over their desperate circumstances and its moments of tenderness and support, plays out within hearing of children who are forced to mature rapidly under these conditions. The teenage son, Patrick, at 16, already shouldering adult responsibilities in the family's struggle for survival, shows signs of the restlessness that comes from having no space to call his own, no opportunity for the solitude that might help him process the enormous changes and challenges he faces daily. His sister Mary, at 14, must navigate the transition to young womanhood without any possibility of the privacy that might ease this difficult process. But perhaps most poignantly, you observe how the younger children adapt to these circumstances, with a resilience that speaks to the fundamental human capacity for adaptation. 8-year-old Liam has learned to create psychological privacy by focusing intensely on small tasks, arranging and rearranging the family's few possessions, or studying the patterns in the turf flames that allow him to withdraw mentally from the constant presence of others. 6-year-old Bridget has developed an imaginary world that she inhabits during the long hours when the family must remain inside due to weather, or when there's simply nothing else to do. You watch her lips moving silently as she conducts elaborate internal conversations and adventures that provide the mental stimulation and creative outlet that her physical environment cannot offer. As the family settles into sleep, pressed together on the earthen floor beside their cow, you realize that this arrangement represents more than mere poverty or primitive living conditions. It reflects a way of life that prioritizes collective survival over individual comfort, family cohesion over personal privacy, and mutual dependence over independence. But you also recognize the enormous psychological and physical strain that such arrangements place on every member of the family. How do people maintain their sanity when privacy is impossible? How do they manage conflict when there's no space to retreat and recover? How do they preserve hope when their daily reality offers so little evidence that circumstances might improve? And how do they prepare their children for a world beyond this single room when that room contains their entire experience of life? As the November wind howls around the O'Sullivan cottage and rain begins to seep through the deteriorating thatch, you witness the profound challenges that arise when 8 people and a cow must negotiate not just physical space, but emotional territory within the confines of a single room. The romantic notion of family togetherness dissolves quickly when you observe the real tensions and accommodations required for this level of enforced intimacy. Tonight, as on every night for the past several months, the family's survival depends not just on their ability to stay warm and fed, but on their capacity to manage the psychological pressures of constant proximity. The teenage children, Patrick and Mary, have developed a complex system of silent communication that allows them to coordinate care of their younger siblings while avoiding the conflicts that inevitably arise when adolescent emotions must be contained within such tight quarters. You watch Patrick's quiet frustration as he tries to find a sleeping position that doesn't involve contact with his siblings while still remaining close enough to the fire to avoid the bone-deep cold that can develop during the night. At 16, he has outgrown the simple comfort of family closeness, but the cottage offers no alternative. His shoulders press against the cow's warm flank on one side, while his younger brother curls against his back, and every adjustment he makes to relieve his discomfort affects the sleeping arrangement of at least 3 other people. Mary faces different but equally challenging constraints. As the eldest daughter, she bears responsibility for many of the domestic tasks that keep the family functioning, but she must perform these duties without any space that belongs to her alone. Her monthly cycles must be managed without privacy. Her developing relationships with young men from other cottages must be conducted under the constant observation of her family, and her dreams of a different kind of life must be nurtured in mental spaces that provide the only privacy available to her. The parents, Seamus and Bridget, struggle with their own complex needs for intimacy and individual identity within the collective family space. RTE Brainstorm reveals that entire families slept together huddled on the floor beside the fire, but this clinical description fails to capture the emotional reality of adult relationships that must be maintained under such circumstances. You observe the subtle ways Seamus and Bridget create moments of connection despite the presence of their children and the cow, a hand touching briefly during the reorganization of the fire. Whispered conversations in Irish Gaelic that the younger children don't fully understand, shared glances that communicate volumes about their concerns for the family's welfare and their hopes for better times ahead. But the strain shows in other ways as well. Bridget's patience with the younger children wears thin more quickly than it might if she had even a few moments of solitude each day. Seamus's worries about their financial situation and his inability to provide adequately for his family sometimes emerge as sharp words or periods of brooding silence that affect the entire household's emotional atmosphere. The cow, whose presence is essential for the family's survival, also contributes to the complexity of their nighttime arrangements. While her warmth is welcome, her size means that human sleeping positions must be carefully planned to avoid being kicked or stepped on if she shifts position during the night. Her digestive processes, while natural, add to the atmospheric challenges of the small space. Her occasional restlessness, triggered by sounds outside or simple animal discomfort, can wake the entire family. Tonight, as you observe the family's evening routine, you notice signs of the health problems that inevitably arise from these living conditions. The youngest child, 2-year-old Thomas, has developed a persistent cough that seems to worsen in the damp, smoky air of the cottage. His breathing is labored, and his mother's attention to his condition creates additional tension as she tries to position him for the best air circulation while still keeping him warm and close to the fire. The family's diet, severely limited by the famine conditions affecting all of Ireland, provides inadequate nutrition for the energy required to maintain body heat in these conditions. You watch as they carefully ration their meager meal, primarily potatoes when available, sometimes supplemented by milk from their cow, ensuring that the youngest and oldest family members receive priority while the stronger adolescents and adults make do with smaller portions. But perhaps most troubling is the evidence of the psychological toll that constant proximity and survival stress place on family relationships. The younger children, particularly 8-year-old Liam and 6-year-old Bridget, show signs of the hypervigilance that develops when children must constantly monitor the emotional state of stressed adults. They have learned to read their parents' moods with extraordinary sensitivity, adjusting their own behavior to avoid adding to family tensions. The older children bear different burdens. Patrick has assumed adult responsibilities for family security and economic survival that should be far beyond his years, while Mary manages household tasks and childcare duties that leave her little energy for her own developmental needs. Both teenagers show the premature aging that comes from carrying adult responsibilities without the emotional support systems that adults typically rely upon. As the family settles into sleep, you observe the complex negotiations required when personal hygiene, medical needs, and natural body functions must be managed within a space that offers no privacy. The single wooden bucket that serves multiple purposes must be shared and managed discreetly. Illness cannot be isolated. Personal cleanliness depends on weather conditions that allow for washing outside and the availability of water that isn't needed for drinking or cooking. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, you also witness the remarkable adaptations that allow this family to maintain emotional bonds and mutual support. The children have developed games and stories that can be played or told quietly without disturbing others. The parents have found ways to provide individual attention and encouragement to each child, despite the impossibility of private conversations. The family has created rituals and traditions that provide emotional anchor points in the midst of their uncertain circumstances. The cow, while complicating their sleeping arrangements, also serves as a shared responsibility that brings the family together in caring for something beyond themselves. The children take turns providing her with fresh rushes, ensuring she has adequate food and water, and monitoring her health and comfort. This shared care creates a sense of purpose and accomplishment that helps counterbalance the helplessness they feel regarding their own circumstances. But as the night deepens and the temperature drops, you recognize that this family's survival depends on factors beyond their control. The weather, the success or failure of their tiny crop, the policies of landlords and government officials, the availability of work, and the progress of diseases that spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions all affect their ability to continue this precarious existence. How long can human beings sustain this level of stress and proximity without suffering permanent psychological or physical damage? What happens when the delicate balance of cooperation and mutual support breaks down under the pressure of sustained crisis? And what kind of future can children who grow up in such circumstances reasonably hope for in a world that offers so few alternatives? As winter deepens and the O'Sullivan family enters what may be their most dangerous months, you witness the moment when survival itself hangs on the thread of their ability to maintain cooperation and hope within their impossibly constrained circumstances. This is January 1848, and the famine that has already killed over 1 million Irish people shows no signs of abating. The family's single room, which had seemed barely adequate for survival, now becomes the stage for life and death decisions that will determine who lives and who dies. The cow, which had been the family's lifeline, begins showing signs of malnutrition that mirror the family's own declining health. Her milk production has dropped dramatically, and her ribs are beginning to show through her hide. Seamus faces an impossible choice: attempt to keep the animal alive through the winter on their dwindling food supplies, or slaughter her for meat that might feed the family for several weeks, but would eliminate their only source of ongoing nutrition. You observe the family council that takes place as they huddle around their fire, voices kept low to avoid letting neighbors know about their desperate circumstances. Patrick, at 16 already thinking like an adult about survival mathematics, argues for slaughtering the cow immediately while she still has some meat on her bones. Mary, more optimistic about their chances of obtaining seed potatoes for spring planting, advocates for keeping the animal alive as long as possible. Bridget, weakened by months of inadequate nutrition and the demands of nursing her youngest child, finds herself unable to make decisions that once came easily to her. The constant stress of managing family life in a single room while watching her children grow thinner each day has pushed her to the edge of what human psychology can endure. You watch her stare at the fire with an expression of exhaustion so profound that it seems to encompass not just physical tiredness, but a weariness with the very business of staying alive. The younger children, once animated despite their difficulty, circumstances now show the listlessness that comes with serious malnutrition. 8-year-old Liam no longer engages in the imaginative games that had helped him cope with their crowded conditions. 6-year-old Bridget has developed the silent, watchful demeanor of a child who has learned that expressing needs or wants only adds to adult stress. 2-year-old Thomas, whose cough has worsened through the winter, now struggles with breathing difficulties that keep the entire family awake through the night. But perhaps most heartbreaking is the transformation you observe in the family's emotional relationships. The enforced intimacy that had once provided comfort and mutual support now becomes a source of additional strain as each person's suffering is constantly visible to everyone else. There's no privacy for grief, no space for individual processing of loss and fear, no opportunity for the kind of emotional recovery that requires solitude. The cow, unaware of the human dramas surrounding her survival, continues to provide what warmth she can to the family that shares her space. But her presence now serves as a daily reminder of impossible choices and dwindling options. RTA Brainstorm notes that families during this period faced the constant threat of disease in their overcrowded conditions. And you begin to see evidence of the illnesses that spread rapidly when people lack adequate nutrition, clean water, and proper sanitation. As February arrives with harsh winds and frozen ground, the family receives news that many of their neighbors have either died or abandoned their cottages to seek relief in the workhouses or to attempt emigration to America. The O'Sullivan cottage, once part of a small community of similar families, now sits increasingly isolated in a landscape dotted with abandoned homes and untended fields. The decision about the cow becomes academic when she finally succumbs to the combination of malnutrition and cold. The family's grief over losing their primary source of warmth and nutrition is complicated by relief that the decision has been made for them and by the knowledge that her meat might sustain them for several more weeks. But the process of butchering and preserving the meat in their single room without proper tools or adequate knowledge becomes another trial that tests their ability to work together under extreme stress. You witness the family's adaptation to life without their bovine roommate as the cottage immediately becomes colder and somehow seems larger despite the unchanged dimensions. The children cluster more closely together for warmth, and the parents take turns staying awake through the night to tend the fire that now provides their only heat source. But something unexpected begins to emerge from this deepening crisis. The family's survival now depends so completely on their cooperation that individual concerns and conflicts become luxuries they can no longer afford. Patrick and Mary, who had struggled with the normal sibling rivalries of adolescence, now work, together with an efficiency and mutual support that transcends their age difference. The younger children, while physically weakened, develop an emotional resilience and mutual care that becomes their primary strength. Seamus and Bridget, stripped of their illusions about providing traditional parental protection and security, instead offer their children the gift of honest acknowledgement of their circumstances and genuine partnership in the work of survival. The family's conversations, necessarily conducted in the presence of everyone, become exercises in democratic decision-making, where even the youngest voices are heard and considered. As spring finally begins to arrive and rumours spread of potential government relief efforts, the O'Sullivan family has been fundamentally changed by their winter of survival. The single room that had once seemed like a prison imposed by poverty has become the crucible in which they've forged bonds of interdependence and mutual respect that might not have developed under less extreme circumstances. But the physical and psychological costs of their ordeal are evident in ways that will affect them for years to come. Patrick's premature assumption of adult responsibilities has accelerated his maturation in some ways while stunting his emotional development in others. Mary's domestic skills have advanced remarkably, but her opportunities for education and personal growth have been severely limited. The younger children have learned survival skills and emotional toughness that will serve them well, but they've also been exposed to adult fears and responsibilities that no child should have to bear. The cottage itself tells the story of their struggle. The earthen floor, worn smooth by the constant presence of human and animal bodies, bears stains and impressions that mark the locations where different family members spent the worst nights of winter. The walls, blackened by months of turf smoke, seem to hold the memory of whispered conversations, muffled sobs, and the sounds of labored breathing during the family's most difficult hours. As summer approaches and the family begins to contemplate the possibility of planting a small crop, they face the challenge of rebuilding their lives while continuing to live in the same constrained space where they've endured so much suffering. The single room that contained their survival now must also accommodate their recovery, their planning for the future, and their attempts to restore some normalcy to family relationships that have been tested beyond all reasonable limits. The cow's absence continues to affect every aspect of their daily routine. Without her body heat, they must burn more of their precious turf to stay warm. Without her milk, they must find alternative sources of nutrition for the youngest children. Without her presence as a shared responsibility that united the family in common purpose, they must discover new ways to maintain the cooperation that proved essential to their survival. But perhaps most significantly, the family must now navigate the complex process of grieving for what they've lost while still living in the space where so much loss occurred. The cottage holds memories of better times when all the children were healthy, when the cow provided daily milk, when the future seemed to hold at least the possibility of modest improvement. Those memories coexist with more recent experiences of hunger, cold, fear, and the constant possibility of death. As you observe the family's evening routine in late spring, you notice both the similarities to and differences from the patterns you witnessed during their crisis months. They still gather around the central fire as darkness falls. They still arrange themselves for sleep on the earthen floor according to considerations of warmth, safety, and family hierarchy. But there's a new quality to their interactions, a combination of gratitude for survival and awareness of how fragile their security remains. The children, while physically recovering from the worst effects of malnutrition, show psychological changes that speak to the profound impact of their experience. They display a level of cooperation and mutual care that goes far beyond normal sibling relationships. They've learned to share resources, space, and attention in ways that reflect their recent understanding of scarcity and interdependence. Yet questions remain about the long-term effects of their ordeal. How will these children, who've experienced such extreme poverty and constraint, adapt if they're eventually able to live in larger spaces or more prosperous circumstances? How will parents who've been forced to involve their children so completely in adult decisions and responsibilities re-establish appropriate boundaries as conditions improve? And how will a family that has shared every moment of crisis and survival learn to allow individual privacy and independence if such opportunities become available? You find yourself standing in the gas-lit doorway of a doss house in Whitechapel on a fog-shrouded December evening in 1888, watching as London's most desperate inhabitants negotiate the purchase of a few hours' rest in conditions that challenge every assumption about human dignity and the basic requirements for sleep. The sign above the door, hand-painted in uneven letters, advertises clean beds 4D and sitting room 1D, but these euphemistic descriptions barely hint at the reality of what awaits inside this Victorian experiment in profitable human warehousing. Historics. UK reveals that if you lived on the streets and had managed to make some money during the day, you could spend the night in one of three ways, depending on how much you had: paying a penny to sit up, 2 pence to hang over, or 4 or 5 pennies to lie down. These were not choices made from preference, but calculations of survival made by people for whom the difference between 1 penny and 2 could mean the difference between some rest and none at all. The clientele gathering outside this establishment represents the lowest stratum of Victorian society: day labourers who couldn't find work, former soldiers disabled by service in distant colonial wars, women whose economic options had been eliminated by industrial changes or personal catastrophes, and children who had aged out of workhouse care with no family or prospects to support them. Each carries their worldly possessions in bundles small enough to be guarded while sleeping, and each approaches the evening's transaction with the weary expertise of someone who has made similar calculations many times before. You observe the elderly man at the front of the queue, his clothes bearing evidence of a more prosperous past, but now worn thin by months of daily use and irregular washing opportunities. He counts and recounts the coins in his palm, perhaps earnings from a day of sweeping crossings or carrying packages, trying to determine whether he can afford the luxury of a 4-penny coffin or must settle for the penny sit-up that will leave him exhausted and vulnerable to illness. Behind him, a woman of perhaps 40 years clutches a bundle containing sewing materials and a few pieces of mended clothing that represent her attempts to earn money through needlework. Her calculation involves not just the cost of shelter, but the need to preserve enough money to purchase materials for tomorrow's work. The choice between rest and the possibility of future income creates a daily dilemma that has no satisfactory solution. The proprietor of this establishment, a man whose appearance suggests he's never personally experienced the accommodations he provides, stands behind a small wooden counter, collecting fees with the efficiency of someone processing commercial transactions rather than selling basic human needs. His ledger records payments with careful attention to preventing any patron from claiming services not purchased, and his assistant moves through the establishment ensuring that the rigid rules governing each type of accommodation are strictly enforced. As you follow the penny sit-up customers into the first room, you encounter the most basic level of commercialized sleep available in Victorian London. Historic UK describes how customers would sit on long, wooden benches arranged in rows, forbidden from lying down or fully relaxing, with monitors employed to ensure that no one fell asleep, since the right to sleep was not included in the penny price. The room holds perhaps 40 people, arranged on benches that have been designed to maximize capacity rather than comfort. The wooden seats, worn smooth by countless occupants, offer no backing for support, forcing customers to sit upright throughout the night. The spacing between benches allows for minimal legroom, and the proximity of other occupants means that every movement, every sound, every bodily function affects multiple neighbors. You watch as the patrons develop strategies for enduring the long hours until dawn. Some lean against the walls, though the monitors quickly discourage any position that might lead to actual sleep. Others engage in quiet conversations with neighbors, finding that social interaction helps pass the time and provides distraction from physical discomfort. A few attempt to doze while remaining technically upright, a skill that requires practice and carries the constant risk of falling and being ejected without refund. The air in the penny sit-up room grows thick with the exhalations of 40 people in a space designed for perhaps 20. The single oil lamp provides minimal illumination, creating shadows that shift and move as people adjust their positions. The sounds of coughing, whispered conversations, and shifting bodies create a constant background noise that makes rest difficult even for those who master the art of sleeping while sitting. But the most challenging aspect of the penny sit-up arrangement may be the psychological pressure of spending an entire night in enforced proximity to strangers while maintaining the vigilance necessary to protect one's few possessions and avoid conflicts that could result in ejection. The social dynamics that develop in this pressurized environment reflect the broader tensions of Victorian urban life, where economic desperation creates both solidarity and competition among those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. Moving to the next room, you encounter the customers who have paid the additional penny for the 2-penny hangover. Historic UK explains that for this extra payment, customers could sleep literally hanging over a rope, an arrangement that was possibly marginally more comfortable, since if you fell asleep, the rope would prevent you from slipping onto the floor or headbutting the bench in front of you. The 2-penny hangover room contains rope stretched between wooden posts at chest height, creating a primitive support system that allows customers to lean forward and rest their upper bodies while remaining technically upright. The ropes, worn smooth and darkened by the oils from countless bodies, bear the weight of perhaps 30 people who arrange themselves along the available length with the careful spacing of individuals who understand that their comfort depends on the cooperation of their neighbors. You observe the practiced efficiency with which regular customers position themselves for the night. Those with experience understand that the location along the rope affects both comfort and safety. Positions near the walls offer some additional support but may be colder, while central positions provide shared body heat but require more careful balance. The negotiation of these positions reflects both unspoken hierarchies based on regularity of patronage and the immediate practical considerations of size, health, and individual needs. The rope itself becomes a shared lifeline that connects all the customers in an intimate physical relationship. When one person shifts position, the movement travels along the rope to affect everyone else. Snoring, coughing, or restless movement by any individual disrupts the precarious balance that allows the system to function. Yet you also observe moments of unexpected cooperation as customers help steady a neighbor who's losing balance or share body heat during the coldest hours of the night. The proprietor's assistant makes regular rounds through both the penny sit-up and 2-penny hangover rooms, enforcing rules that maintain order while maximizing profit. Customers who fall asleep in positions not included in their payment are awakened and repositioned. Those who cause disturbances are ejected without refund. The timing of these rounds, seemingly random but actually calculated to prevent customers from getting more rest than they've purchased, adds an element of surveillance that makes genuine relaxation nearly impossible. As the night progresses, you begin to understand the complex calculations that govern this Victorian marketplace for sleep. The difference between the penny sit-up and the 2-penny hangover is measured not in luxury, but in the subtle degrees of discomfort that separate various levels of desperation. The customers who can afford neither option spend the night walking the streets, seeking shelter in doorways or attempting to gain access to church steps or other marginally protected spaces. But what happens at dawn when these carefully orchestrated arrangements must end and the customers must return to the streets to begin another day's search for the coins that will determine tomorrow night's sleeping options? How do people maintain their health and sanity under such conditions? And what kind of society creates and sustains institutions that commercialize the most basic human needs in ways that preserve neither dignity nor adequate rest? As the hours pass in the Whitechapel Doss house and you observe the intricate social dynamics that develop among people forced into such intimate proximity by desperation rather than choice, you begin to understand that these arrangements create their own complex hierarchy and unwritten rules of conduct. The rope that supports the two-penny hangover customers becomes not just a physical lifeline, but a social boundary that defines relationships, establishes territories, and governs interactions among strangers who must depend on each other for the minimal comfort their few pence can purchase. The regular customers, those who appear night after night in the same establishment, have developed an informal social structure that helps manage the tensions and practical challenges of shared sleeping space. You observe how Albert, a former dock worker, whose injured back prevents him from heavy labor, has established himself as an unofficial mediator who helps newcomers understand the unspoken rules while also intervening in disputes before they escalate to the level that would attract the attention of the proprietor's assistant. Albert's authority derives not from any official position, but from his combination of experience, physical presence despite his disability, and genuine concern for the welfare of his fellow patrons. He understands that everyone's comfort depends on cooperation, and he has developed skills for de-escalating conflicts that might otherwise result in multiple ejections and lost sleep for everyone in the room. You watch him guide a newcomer, a young woman whose circumstances have clearly deteriorated recently, given the quality of her clothing despite its current condition, to a position on the rope that will provide adequate support while avoiding contact with customers whose behavior or hygiene might create additional problems for someone already struggling to adapt to these conditions. His quiet explanation of the room's dynamics, delivered in whispers that don't disturb others, represents a form of social service that receives no compensation but serves the essential function of maintaining order. The woman who gives her name only as Sarah represents the changing demographics of London's homeless population during this period. Economic changes brought about by industrialization have eliminated many traditional forms of women's work, while social conventions prevent respectable women from pursuing alternatives that might provide adequate income. Her presence in the Doss house reflects not personal failure, but broader social changes that have created new categories of homelessness among people who would not have faced such circumstances in earlier generations. Sarah's adjustment to the rope sleeping arrangement illustrates the physical and psychological challenges faced by newcomers to this system. The rope provides support for her upper body, but requires constant attention to balance that prevents the deep sleep her exhausted body desperately needs. The proximity of strangers, particularly men whose hygiene and health status are unknown, creates anxiety that adds to her exhaustion. The sounds and smells of the overcrowded room assault senses already overstimulated by the stress of her changed circumstances. But you also observe her gradual adaptation to the social dynamics of the rope community. The man positioned next to her, an elderly street sweeper named Thomas, shares techniques for finding the most comfortable rope position and warns her about the assistant's rounds that will wake anyone who appears to be sleeping too soundly. This informal mentorship, provided without expectation of return, reflects the solidarity that can develop among people who recognize their shared vulnerability. The rope itself becomes a communication medium that transmits not just physical movements but emotional states and social information. You notice how tension travels along the rope when someone becomes agitated or worried, affecting the balance and comfort of everyone connected to the same section. Conversely, the deep breathing of someone who has achieved a state of rest can have a calming effect that spreads to their neighbours. Historic UK notes that people were crammed in as tightly as possible and that it was not unheard of for there to be one or two people who could not be woken the next morning, having frozen to death during the night. This grim reality creates an additional layer of social responsibility among the rope sleepers, who develop informal systems for monitoring each other's welfare throughout the night. You observe how Albert periodically checks on the older and more vulnerable customers, particularly during the coldest hours before dawn when hypothermia becomes a serious risk. His quiet words of encouragement to someone struggling with the cold, or his subtle adjustment of positions to ensure better heat distribution, represent life-saving interventions that receive no recognition but may determine who survives until morning. The economics of the DOS house also create complex social relationships around the question of payment and credit. While the proprietor operates on a strictly cash basis, the customers sometimes develop informal arrangements for sharing resources or providing assistance to those who fall short of the required fee. You watch as Thomas, the street sweeper, quietly slips a halfpenny to a younger man whose earnings for the day were insufficient for the two-penny hangover, accepting the risk that his own situation might deteriorate before he can replace those funds. These acts of generosity occur within a broader context of competition for limited resources and opportunities. The same people who share their coins for sleeping accommodations may find themselves competing for work opportunities the next day. The social bonds formed in the DOS house must be balanced against the practical requirements of individual survival in an economy that offers few safety nets for those who fall behind. The proprietor's assistant, making his regular rounds through the rope room, represents the commercial reality that underlies these social arrangements. His job is to ensure that customers receive exactly the service they've purchased, no more, no less, while maintaining order and maximizing the number of paying customers who can be accommodated. His interactions with the rope sleepers are purely transactional, focused on rule enforcement rather than customer welfare. Yet even this commercial relationship creates its own social dynamics. Experienced customers learn to anticipate the assistant's rounds and adjust their behavior accordingly. They develop strategies for appearing awake and alert during inspections while maximizing rest between checks. Some establish informal relationships with the assistant that provide small advantages, advance warning of inspections, tolerance for minor rule infractions, or assistance with conflicts that might otherwise result in ejection. As dawn approaches, and the rope sleepers prepare for their ejection back onto the streets, you observe the complex process of transitioning from the artificial community of the DOS house to the competitive reality of daytime survival. Friendships and alliances formed during the night must be balanced against the practical requirements of seeking work, finding food, and earning the money that will determine tomorrow night's sleeping arrangements. The rope that has supported them through the night becomes a symbol of both their shared vulnerability and their temporary solidarity. As the assistant announces that the rope will be cut at 6 a.m., forcing everyone out onto the streets, you see how this daily ritual combines practical necessity with symbolic violence. The cutting of the rope that has literally supported them serves as a reminder of their precarious position in society and the temporary nature of any comfort or security they manage to achieve. But what happens to the social relationships formed in this pressurized environment? Do the bonds created by shared desperation translate into mutual support during daytime hours, or do they dissolve under the pressure of individual survival needs? How do people maintain their humanity and dignity when their most basic needs are commodified and regulated by commercial interests? And what kind of psychological toll does this nightly routine of artificial community and daily ejection exact on people who may have few other sources of social connection? At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, as grey London light begins to filter through the grimy windows of the Whitechapel DOS house, you witness the daily ritual that historic UK describes with stark simplicity. The rope would be unceremoniously cut the next morning at 5 or 6 a.m., This was done for the dual purpose of freeing up the space, but it also served as a reminder to those lowest in society of just where their place was. Once the rope was cut, the homeless would be kicked out onto the streets once more. The cutting of the rope represents far more than a practical business procedure. It's a daily demonstration of powerlessness that strips away any illusion of security or stability that the night's community might have provided. You watch as the assistant approaches with a sharp knife, announcing the end of sleeping time with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed this task hundreds of times without considering its human impact. The rope sleepers, roused from whatever rest they manage to achieve, struggle to orient themselves and gather their possessions before the rope that has supported them through the night is severed. Sarah, the newcomer whose adaptation you observed during the night, startles awake with the confusion of someone still adjusting to this routine. Her momentary disorientation as she loses the rope's support serves as a physical metaphor for the broader instability that governs every aspect of her existence. Albert, the informal leader whose guidance helped maintain order during the night, demonstrates the practiced efficiency of someone who has endured this daily ejection countless times. His movements are economical and purposeful as he collects his few possessions and prepares to face another day of seeking work with a body that has received minimal rest and a spirit that has been systematically reminded of his social worthlessness. The next younger man who received Thomas's halfpenny assistance during the night now faces the complex social challenge of acknowledging this debt while managing his own survival needs. The generosity that seemed natural in the solidarity of shared rope sleeping becomes more complicated in the competitive environment of daytime London, where the same people who supported each other through the night may find themselves competing for the limited opportunities available to people in their circumstances. As the rope is cut and falls to the floor, you observe the immediate transformation in social dynamics. The artificial community created by shared physical support dissolves instantly, replaced by the individualistic calculations required for street survival. The rope that connected them becomes a barrier as people step over it to reach the door, each focused on the immediate challenges of finding breakfast, locating potential work, or simply staying warm during the day ahead. The transition from the doss house to the street exposes the customers to the full impact of London's industrial atmosphere. The air outside, thick with coal smoke and industrial pollutants, assaults lungs already compromised by a night in overcrowded, poorly ventilated conditions. The noise of morning traffic, factory whistles, and street vendors creates a sensory overload for people whose systems are depleted by inadequate rest and nutrition. Yet you also observe the remarkable resilience that allows these individuals to transform themselves from rope sleepers to active participants in London's economy within minutes of their ejection. Sarah smooths her clothing and arranges her appearance to present the most respectable image possible as she sets out to seek needlework or other employment that might provide income for another night's shelter. Her rapid transition from vulnerable sleeper to determined job seeker demonstrates the psychological flexibility required for this kind of precarious existence. The daily routine that follows ejection from the doss house reflects the complex geography of survival in Victorian London. Different types of work become available at different times and locations throughout the city, requiring detailed knowledge of schedules, locations, and requirements that can only be acquired through experience. The former dock worker, Albert, heads toward the areas where casual labor might be available, while Thomas, the street sweeper, begins his circuit of the neighborhoods where his services are tolerated or welcomed. But the night's sleeping arrangements have physical consequences that affect daytime performance and earning potential. The rope sleeping position, while preventing complete collapse, creates muscle strain and joint stiffness that can impair a person's ability to perform physical labor. The lack of genuine rest affects concentration, reaction time, and emotional stability in ways that make all forms of work more difficult and less likely to result in steady employment. The social connections formed during the night create both opportunities and complications for daytime survival. Albert's reputation as someone who helps maintain order in the DOS house translates into a form of social capital that can be valuable in other contexts, but it also creates expectations and obligations that may conflict with his own immediate needs. His willingness to share information about work opportunities or to provide character references for other former rope sleepers reflects a form of mutual aid that extends beyond the DOS house walls. Yet the economics of survival often force individuals to prioritize immediate personal needs over longer-term social relationships. The halfpenny that Thomas shared with a struggling younger man represents a significant portion of his daily earnings, and his ability to continue such generosity depends on his own success in finding adequate work. The tension between individual survival and community support creates daily moral challenges that have no clear solutions. As the morning progresses and the former rope sleepers disperse throughout London in search of work and sustenance, you begin to understand the broader social systems that create and sustain the DOS house economy. The same industrial developments that have eliminated traditional forms of employment have created new forms of casual labor that provide just enough income to keep workers alive while offering no security or advancement opportunities. The DOS houses themselves represent a form of social management that addresses homelessness through commercialization rather than elimination. By providing minimal shelter at minimal cost, these establishments prevent the complete social breakdown that might result from leaving desperate people with no options at all, while simultaneously ensuring that homelessness remains profitable for property owners and uncomfortable enough to motivate continued participation in the labor market. The customer's daily routine of earning just enough money to purchase another night's inadequate shelter creates a cycle that's almost impossible to break. The physical and psychological costs of rope sleeping prevent the accumulation of energy and resources that might allow for improvement in circumstances. The constant focus on immediate survival needs prevents longer-term planning or skill development that might lead to better employment opportunities. Yet within this constrained system, you observe moments of genuine human connection and mutual support that transcend the commercial relationships that define most interactions. The informal mentorship that Albert provides to newcomers, the sharing of resources that occurs despite scarcity, and the development of social networks that extend beyond the DOS house walls, all represent forms of resistance to the dehumanizing effects of extreme poverty. As evening approaches and the former rope sleepers begin to return to the DOS house to negotiate another night's accommodation, you recognize that this daily cycle represents more than individual stories of hardship. It reflects broader questions about the responsibility of society to provide for its most vulnerable members, the relationship between economic systems and human dignity, and the ways that people maintain hope and humanity under conditions designed to strip away both. The rope that will be stretched across the room tonight will support a new configuration of bodies. As some former customers have found better accommodations, others have failed to earn sufficient money for admission, and newcomers have joined the ranks of those dependent on this minimal form of commercial shelter. But the social dynamics, the physical challenges, and the daily cycle of artificial community and forced dispersal will continue, creating and recreating the conditions that define survival at the bottom of Victorian society. You climb the narrow, creaking stairs of a 5-story tenement building on Manhattan's Lower East Side in the spring of 1905, following the sounds of multiple languages and the smells of cooking food, unwashed bodies, and industrial chemicals that permeate the air of this overcrowded neighborhood. Each floor holds 4 apartments, and each apartment, originally designed for a single family, now houses multiple families, boarders, and shift workers who have transformed every available space into sleeping quarters that operate around the clock. The apartment you enter on the 4th floor, measuring roughly 300 square feet, has been divided by hanging sheets and temporary partitions into 6 distinct sleeping areas, each rented to different tenants who work different shifts in the garment factories, steel mills, and service industries that drive New York's explosive industrial growth. History.com reveals that tenements were known for cramped spaces and poor living conditions, but this clinical description fails to capture the intricate choreography required when 6 strangers must coordinate their sleeping schedules in a space smaller than many modern bedrooms. The current occupants represent the international character of New York's immigrant working class. Giuseppe, a young Italian man who works the night shift in a textile factory, is preparing for sleep as his roommates begin their day. His sleeping area, claimed by hanging a worn blanket from nails driven into the wall, measures approximately 4 feet by 6 feet and contains a thin mattress on the floor, a wooden crate that serves as storage for his few possessions, and a small space where he can sit upright when the mattress is rolled against the wall. In the adjacent space, separated by a sheet that provides visual privacy but no sound insulation, Rosa prepares for her day shift in a garment factory. Her area is virtually identical to Giuseppe's, but she has created small improvements that reflect both her longer tenure in the apartment and her gender-specific needs. A piece of broken mirror nailed to the wall serves as her dressing area, while a curtain made from factory scraps provides additional privacy for personal activities. The coordination required for this arrangement becomes apparent as you observe. The morning routine. Giuseppe, who worked from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., needs quiet and darkness for sleep during the day. Rosa, who must be at her factory by 7 a.m., needs space and light for washing, dressing, and preparing her lunch. Their conflicting needs are managed through a complex system of unspoken agreements and careful timing that has developed through months of shared living. The other 4 occupants of the apartment face similar challenges with their overlapping schedules. Peter, a Slovak steelworker who works the day shift, sleeps during the night in an area that becomes a workspace for Anna, a Polish woman who takes in piecework sewing during the day. Their arrangement requires Peter to vacate his sleeping space by 6 a.m. so Anna can set up her sewing machine and materials, while Anna must clear her work area by 9 p.m. so Peter can sleep. The apartment's single window facing a narrow air shaft that provides minimal light and no fresh air becomes a contested resource as different occupants require different lighting conditions at different times. The tenant who controls the area nearest the window has established informal rules about when curtains can be opened or closed, creating a schedule that attempts to accommodate everyone's needs while often satisfying no one completely. Skyscraper. Museum documents how tenement buildings covered 90% of their narrow lots, creating dense blocks where slum problems of crime, disease, and family breakdown resulted from complex mixes of bad quality housing with social issues of poverty, overcrowding, poor medical care, and exploitative working conditions. But these statistics cannot convey the intimate human reality of what occurs when people attempt to create private lives within such constrained and shared spaces. The apartment's single toilet, located in the hallway and shared with 3 other apartments, requires careful scheduling and creates additional complications for residents whose work schedules don't align with typical usage patterns. Giuseppe, returning from his night shift, must often wait in line with tenants from other apartments who are beginning their day, adding time and stress to his transition from work to sleep. The kitchen, such as it is, consists of a small coal stove and a basin for washing dishes with minimal storage space for food or cooking equipment. The 6 tenants have developed a complex rotation system for cooking and eating that allows each person access to the facilities while preventing conflicts over space and resources. Meals are often eaten in sleeping areas, requiring residents to balance plates on beds or makeshift tables while maintaining awareness of their impact on neighbors who may be sleeping just inches away. Personal hygiene becomes a challenging negotiation in these circumstances. The single basin serves for washing dishes, cleaning clothes, and personal bathing, with privacy provided by the same hanging sheets that divide sleeping areas. The scheduling of these activities requires coordination and consideration that extends far beyond typical roommate arrangements, as someone's bathing schedule can affect multiple neighbors' sleep, work preparation, and personal comfort. The financial arrangements that make this living situation possible reflect the desperate economics of immigrant life in industrial New York. Each tenant pays approximately $2 to $3 per week for their sleeping space, which represents a significant portion of their weekly wages, but still costs less than any private accommodation they could afford. The apartment's primary tenant, who holds the lease and collects rent from the others, must maintain this delicate balance of maximizing income while ensuring that overcrowding doesn't reach levels that would attract unwanted attention from city inspectors. Rosa, who has lived in the apartment longest, serves as an informal coordinator who helps new tenants understand the complex schedule and social rules that make cohabitation possible. Her experience has taught her that small conflicts, if not addressed quickly, can escalate into major disruptions that affect everyone's sleep, work performance, and income. She has developed skills in mediation and compromise that would be impressive in any context, but are essential for survival in these conditions. The seasonal changes that affect New York's industrial economy create additional complications for the apartment's arrangements. During busy periods in the garment industry, some tenants work longer hours or additional shifts that disrupt established schedules. During economic downturns, tenants may lose work and struggle to pay rent, forcing everyone to renegotiate both financial and spatial arrangements. You observe how Giuseppe's night shift schedule affects his health and social connections in ways that extend far beyond the immediate challenges of daytime sleeping. His work hours prevent him from participating in many of the social activities that help immigrants maintain cultural connections and build community support networks. His sleep needs during daylight hours often conflict with the apartment's busiest periods, creating isolation that compounds the stress of his working conditions. The apartment's acoustic properties mean that every sound travels throughout the space, creating an environment where privacy becomes almost impossible to maintain. Conversations, snoring, coughing, and the sounds of personal activities all become shared experiences, whether residents want them to be or not. The tenants have developed strategies for managing this enforced intimacy, including specific quiet hours, designated conversation areas, and unspoken agreements about which sounds are acceptable at which times. The health implications of these living arrangements extend beyond the obvious problems of overcrowding and poor ventilation. The stress of constant vigilance about schedules, noise levels, and social interactions creates psychological pressures that affect sleep quality even when physical conditions allow for rest. The lack of genuine privacy means that emotional processing and recovery from daily stresses must occur within the awareness and potential judgment of strangers. The apartment's location within the larger tenement building creates additional layers of complexity. Sounds from other apartments, foot traffic in hallways, and activities in adjacent buildings all contribute to an environment where complete quiet is never available. The building's structural problems, including inadequate heat in winter and poor ventilation in summer, affect all residents regardless of their individual sleeping arrangements. You notice how the seasonal cycle affects the apartment's livability in ways that require constant adaptation. Summer heat, trapped by poor ventilation and the body heat of 6 people in a small space, creates conditions that make sleep difficult regardless of schedule coordination. Winter cold, penetrating through inadequate insulation and heating, forces residents to make difficult choices between fuel costs and basic comfort. The immigrant experience adds cultural dimensions to these physical challenges. Different backgrounds bring different expectations about privacy, cleanliness, noise levels, and social interaction that must be negotiated daily among people who often share no common language except broken English. The apartment becomes a space where old-world traditions meet new-world necessities, creating hybrid solutions that satisfy no one completely but allow everyone to survive. As you observe Giuseppe finally settling into sleep while his roommates begin their day shifts, you recognize that this apartment represents more than a housing arrangement. It's a complex social and economic system that allows industrial capitalism to extract maximum labor from immigrant workers while providing the minimum conditions necessary for survival and continued productivity. The tenement system, which Skyscraper Museum describes as covering 90% of available lot space to maximize rental income, creates conditions where every square foot must serve multiple purposes, and every hour must accommodate different users. The efficiency is remarkable from an economic perspective, but the human costs accumulate in ways that affect not just the immediate residents, but the broader social fabric of immigrant communities. But how do people maintain their individual identity and personal relationships when their most private activities must be conducted within sight and sound of strangers? What happens when illness strikes one resident and threatens the health and economic stability of everyone in the apartment? How do cultural conflicts get resolved when people from different backgrounds must share not just space but the most intimate details of daily life? And what are the long-term psychological effects of living in conditions where privacy, quiet, and personal space become luxuries that few can afford? As summer heat settles over Manhattan's Lower East Side and the temperature inside the fourth-floor apartment climbs past tolerable levels, you witness how the careful social arrangements that allow 6 strangers to share this space begin to strain under the additional pressure of seasonal challenges that threaten both physical health and psychological stability. The morning routine that had seemed manageable in cooler months now becomes a source of conflict as each person's need for air, space, and relief from heat creates demands that cannot be satisfied within the apartment's limited resources. Giuseppe, attempting to sleep during the day shift change, finds that the heat makes rest nearly impossible even when his roommates maintain relative quiet. His body, exhausted from 8 hours of night shift work in a poorly ventilated textile factory, struggles to cool down in an apartment where 6 people's breathing and body heat combine with the summer sun to create temperatures that regularly exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The apartment's single window, already inadequate for ventilation, becomes a battleground as different residents require different conditions for their activities. Anna needs light for her piecework sewing, but opening the window during the hottest part of the day only adds to the oppressive heat. Peter, who works in the steel mills and returns home already overheated, desperately needs whatever cooling air might be available, while Rosa, preparing for her factory shift, needs conditions that won't leave her appearance disheveled before she even begins work. Skyscraper Museum documents how overcrowded apartments exacerbated problems such as the spread of disease, and you begin to observe the early signs of the health crises that summer heat can trigger in these conditions. The apartment's residents, weakened by poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, and constant stress, become more susceptible to the illnesses that spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions. Maria, a young woman who works in a garment factory and occupies the sleeping space nearest. The window develops a persistent cough that keeps her neighbors awake during their rest periods. Her illness, likely contracted in the poorly ventilated factory where she works alongside hundreds of other people, now threatens the health and economic stability of everyone in the apartment. In conditions where missing work due to illness can mean inability to pay rent, any health problem becomes a crisis that affects the entire group. The apartment's single water source, a faucet in the kitchen that provides intermittent cold water, becomes inadequate for the increased hygiene needs that summer heat creates. The residents must coordinate their washing and cooling activities while managing the apartment's limited space for privacy and the increased time required for personal care in hot weather. You observe how the stress of summer conditions reveals the underlying tensions that careful social arrangements had previously managed to contain. Giuseppe's need for daytime sleep conflicts more severely with his roommate's activities when heat makes any disturbance more disruptive to rest. The noise restrictions that had worked during cooler months become impossible to maintain when windows must be kept open and when heat makes everyone more irritable and less tolerant of normal sounds. The apartment's informal economy, which depends on Anna's piecework sewing and other residents' side activities, faces new challenges as summer heat makes detailed work more difficult and exhausting. Anna's income, which helps her meet rent payments, decreases as her productivity suffers from the combination of heat, poor lighting, and the distractions created by increased conflict among her roommates. Personal hygiene, always challenging, in shared quarters becomes a source of heightened tension as summer heat increases everyone's need for frequent washing while the apartment's facilities remain unchanged. The scheduling system that had managed shared use of the kitchen basin breaks down as increased demand creates longer waits and more conflicts over priorities. The building's overloaded sewage system, designed for single-family occupancy, but now serving multiple families in each apartment, begins to fail under summer heat and increased usage. The smells and health hazards created by inadequate sanitation add to the apartment's livability problems while creating risks that no individual tenant can address through personal action. You notice how the residents' strategies for maintaining privacy and personal space become less effective as heat forces everyone to spend more time in the apartment's common areas seeking relief. The hanging sheets that divide sleeping areas trap heat and become unbearable barriers, while opening them for air circulation eliminates the visual privacy that makes shared living psychologically tolerable. The cultural differences among the residents, previously managed through careful avoidance and respect for others' space, become sources of increased conflict as heat stress reduces everyone's tolerance and patience. Giuseppe's Italian background includes different expectations about noise levels and social interaction than Peter's Slovak traditions, and these differences become more problematic when summer conditions force closer proximity and more frequent interactions. Rosa, whose longer residence in the apartment had established her as an informal mediator, finds her authority challenged as heat-related stress creates conflicts that exceed her experience and diplomatic skills. The residents who had previously accepted her guidance begin to question arrangements that no longer seem to serve everyone's needs adequately. The economic pressures that force people to accept these living conditions intensify during summer months, as increased heat in workplaces creates more stressful and dangerous working conditions while providing no additional income to offset the increased difficulty of home life. The residents find themselves trapped between unacceptable working conditions and equally unacceptable living conditions with no realistic alternatives. You observe the development of heat-related illnesses that go beyond Maria's cough to include exhaustion, dehydration, and skin problems that result from poor air circulation and limited washing facilities. These health problems create cascading effects as sick residents cannot maintain their work schedules, threatening their ability to pay rent while also disrupting the carefully coordinated apartment schedules that depend on everyone maintaining their assigned activities. The apartment's relationship with the building's other tenants becomes more strained as summer conditions create conflicts over shared resources like hallway space for cooling, access to the building's single outdoor area, and use of water facilities during peak demand periods. The competition for marginally better conditions extends beyond the apartment, to encompass the entire tenement building's overcrowded population. The tenement's structural problems, including inadequate insulation and poor ventilation design, become life-threatening during summer heat waves that kill dozens of people in similar buildings throughout the Lower East Side. The residents realize that their survival depends not just on their ability to coordinate their individual needs, but on their capacity to adapt to environmental conditions that exceed the building's design capabilities. As you watch the residents attempt to manage another sweltering night with minimal sleep and maximum discomfort, you begin to understand how seasonal cycles create recurring crises that test the limits of human adaptability. The social arrangements that function during moderate weather become impossible to maintain when environmental stresses exceed the margins of safety that overcrowded conditions already provide. But the approaching winter will bring different but equally severe challenges as heating costs, reduced daylight, and increased time spent indoors create new pressures on the apartment's social and economic arrangements. How will these 6 strangers renegotiate their shared space when cold weather traps them together for longer periods? What happens when economic downturns reduce available work and threaten everyone's ability to maintain their rent payments? And how do people preserve hope and maintain relationships when their living conditions systematically undermine both physical health and psychological stability? As autumn gives way to winter, and the costs of heating the inadequately insulated apartment create new financial pressures for all 6 residents, you witness the culmination of tensions that have been building throughout the months of forced proximity and shared hardship. The delicate balance of schedules, resources, and social accommodation that made their arrangement possible begins to fracture under the combined pressure of economic uncertainty, health problems, and the psychological toll of prolonged overcrowding. The crisis begins with Maria's persistent cough, which has worsened through the fall and now shows signs of developing into tuberculosis, the disease that History.com notes, spread rapidly in tenement conditions where poor ventilation and overcrowding created ideal conditions for transmission. Her illness represents more than a personal health problem. It threatens the survival of everyone in the apartment as they face the possibility of quarantine, job loss, and the disruption of their carefully coordinated living arrangement. Giuseppe, whose night shift schedule had already isolated him from his roommate's social support network, finds himself increasingly unable to maintain the work performance required to keep his job. The combination of inadequate sleep due to apartment conflicts, poor nutrition, and constant stress has weakened his immune system and reduced his physical capacity for the demanding factory work that provides his only income. You observe the apartment's residents as they struggle with the impossible choice between protecting their individual health and maintaining the economic relationships that keep them housed. Maria's obvious illness should prompt her quarantine or removal from the shared space, but her departure would increase everyone else's rent burden while eliminating her income entirely. The collective decision to allow her to remain reflects both compassion and economic necessity, but it also demonstrates how poverty creates situations where rational health decisions become financially impossible. The apartment's heating arrangements, which depend on a small coal stove that provides inadequate warmth for 6 people while consuming money that residents can barely afford, create new sources of conflict as winter deepens. The residents must negotiate not just the scheduling of heating fuel purchases, but the distribution of warmth within the apartment and the coordination of activities that require heat with the need to conserve expensive coal. Peter, whose steel mill work provides the highest income among the apartment's residents, begins to assert more control over shared decisions as his financial contributions become increasingly essential for maintaining heat and rent payments. His growing authority disrupts the previous democratic arrangements that Rosa had facilitated, creating resentments and power imbalances that strain the apartment's social fabric. The winter reduction in available work affects different residents differently, creating economic disparities that threaten their collective ability to maintain rent payments. Anna's piecework sewing, which depends on adequate lighting, becomes nearly impossible during short winter days, while Giuseppe's factory continues operating but reduces hours and pay. The apartment's economic foundation, which depends on everyone, maintaining steady income, becomes increasingly precarious. You notice how the reduced daylight and increased time spent indoors intensify all the apartment's existing problems while creating new sources of conflict. The residents, who had previously managed their shared space through careful scheduling and mutual avoidance, now find themselves forced into closer proximity for longer periods. The psychological pressure of constant human contact without privacy begins to exceed the limits of what their informal social arrangements can manage. The building's heating system, designed for single-family occupancy but now struggling to provide minimal warmth for overcrowded apartments, fails repeatedly during the coldest periods. The residents must choose between accepting dangerous conditions and pooling resources for emergency repairs that they cannot afford. Their decisions reflect the broader impossible choices that poverty creates between immediate survival and long-term stability. The cultural tensions that had been managed through careful accommodation become more problematic as winter stress reduces everyone's tolerance and patience. Giuseppe's Italian customs around food and social interaction conflict more severely with Peter's Slovak expectations when both men spend more time in the apartment due to reduced work schedules. These cultural differences, previously minimized through avoidance, become daily sources of friction when avoidance is no longer possible. Rosa's attempts to maintain her mediating role become increasingly difficult as winter conditions create problems that exceed her experience and authority. The residents who had previously accepted her guidance begin to form alliances based on economic power and cultural affinity, rather than respect for her longer residence and diplomatic skills. The apartment's sanitation problems, serious throughout. The warmer months become health emergencies as winter conditions prevent regular cleaning and maintenance. The building's inadequate plumbing, frozen pipes, and overloaded sewage system create conditions that threaten everyone's health while requiring collective action that the residents are increasingly unable to coordinate. You observe the development of mental health problems that reflect the accumulated stress of months of overcrowding, financial insecurity, and social conflict. Several residents show signs of depression and anxiety that affect their work performance, and social interactions creating cascading problems that threaten the apartment's stability. The lack of privacy means that these psychological struggles become shared burdens that add to everyone else's stress. The breaking point arrives in February when Giuseppe, weakened by months of inadequate sleep and poor living conditions, becomes seriously ill and unable to work. His lost income threatens everyone's ability to maintain rent payments, while his presence in the apartment creates additional health risks for residents who cannot afford to lose work due to illness. The residents face the devastating choice between abandoning Giuseppe to face illness and potential death alone, or risking their own economic survival by maintaining arrangements that no longer function. Their decision reflects both the limits of solidarity that extreme poverty creates and the brutal calculations that survival requires when social safety nets do not exist. As spring approaches and some residents make plans to seek other accommodations, you recognize that the apartment's arrangement was always temporary, a survival strategy that could function only under specific conditions and only for limited periods. The rotation of residents that begins as winter ends represents not failure, but the natural cycle of adaptation that allows people to survive in economic systems that do not provide adequate housing or stable employment. The departing residents take with them the knowledge and skills they developed for managing shared space, negotiating cultural differences, and maintaining cooperation under extreme stress. These abilities, learned through necessity in the tenement apartment, become resources they can apply to new living situations and survival challenges. But the apartment itself continues to house new combinations of desperate workers who must learn to their own versions of the same lessons about cooperation, compromise, and the delicate balance between individual survival and collective well-being. The cycle of overcrowding, conflict, adaptation, and displacement continues as industrial capitalism creates conditions that require extraordinary human flexibility while providing minimal resources for achieving stability. The tenement system that created these conditions represents more than inadequate housing. It reflects broader questions about the relationship between economic efficiency and human dignity, the responsibility of society to provide livable conditions for working people, and the psychological costs of survival strategies that require people to sacrifice privacy, autonomy, and personal relationships for basic shelter. As you observe the apartment preparing for its next group of residents, you understand that the stories of Giuseppe, Rosa, Maria, Peter, Anna, and their unnamed roommate represent millions of similar experiences that shape the development of American cities and the character of immigrant communities. Their struggles with overcrowding, their innovations in cooperation, and their ultimate displacement reflect patterns that continue to define urban life wherever economic pressures exceed the availability of adequate housing and stable employment.